They said the Taíno were gone. Not just conquered, erased. Their names struck from records, their culture folded into myths, their bloodlines lost in time. For centuries, that story stood unchallenged. No graves to visit, no language on the tongue, no box to check on a census. Gone, as if they'd never been. But then, something strange began to surface. Not in history books, but in living bodies. Puerto Ricans taking DNA tests were finding traces that didn't belong to the colonial timeline. At first, it looked like noise, a mistake, but it kept showing up in thousands of people, across regions, across generations. And then came the twist no one could explain. In 2018, buried deep in the soil of the Bahamas, archaeologists uncovered the bones of a woman who lived 1,000 years ago. A Taíno woman, undisturbed by time. They pulled her genome from the grave and compared it to the living. The match was undeniable. Modern Puerto Ricans shared more with her than with any other native group in the Americas. Not a faint echo. A direct thread, as if she had never left. And suddenly, everything broke open. Because this wasn't just about blood. This was about truth being kept alive in the dark, whispered in kitchens, woven into lullabies, protected by women who remembered without being allowed to remember. How many times were children told, "Don't say that in school"? How many grandmothers swallowed their own history just to survive? The state declared them extinct. But extinction doesn't leave fingerprints. It doesn't sing through mitochondrial DNA. And now, the descendants they tried to erase carry her, in their cells, in their skin, in their silence. But if the Taíno never truly disappeared, then the maps are wrong. The timelines are broken. And the people once buried under history were always here. Still, that answer leads to another question. One even stranger, even older. Because this woman, the one buried for 1,000 years, she didn't come from Puerto Rico. She came from somewhere else. To find the beginning of this story, we have to leave the islands. We have to go inland, where rivers twist like veins across the land, and the first migrations began. It didn't begin on an island. Long before Puerto Rico had a name, long before the Spanish, the ships, the silence, a journey had already begun, deep in the lungs of the continent. In the green shadows of the Amazon, where rivers don't flow, they carve, they twist, they pull people forward. This is where the ancestors of the Taíno lived, long before the Caribbean ever echoed with their voices. They weren't lost wanderers. They were skilled navigators, Arawakan-speaking people who moved not by chance, but by design. And when the time came, they didn't follow the coastlines. They followed the rivers. The Orinoco Basin became their artery, a moving highway of water and canoes and intention. They pushed north, toward open sea with something to carry. Language, stories, bones, fire. They brought the knowledge of farming, of how to shape stone into gods, of how to bury the dead in ways that still echo under Puerto Rican soil. Modern genetics confirms it now. The ancient markers inside Puerto Rican DNA don't trace back to the north. They connect precisely, unmistakably, to the Amazon. To the same Arawakan families who once stood ankle-deep in riverbeds, watching their shadows float beside them. And the cultural pieces fall in line like puzzle shards. Ceramics with matching patterns. Spiritual customs that whisper the same names. Burial rituals that mirror each other across islands and jungles. The Caribbean wasn't a dead end. It wasn't an accident. It was chosen, not drift, design. They didn't ride the tides. They engineered their escape. Every crossing was a statement. We are not the forgotten. We are the ones who got away. But what they found waiting for them wasn't freedom. Because as the islands rose before them, lush and untouched, so did the storm that would one day try to erase them. And the first wave was not from the sea. It was made of gold and conquest and skin. They came for gold. They brought steel. But what they left behind was written in blood. In 1508, the Spanish planted their flag in Puerto Rico, not with families, not with balance, but with men. Hundreds of them, soldiers, fortune seekers, colonists, each one chasing wealth, dominion, or salvation. But they came almost entirely alone. By 1530, the numbers told a story no priest would preach. 369 Spanish men, just 57 Spanish women, and surrounding them, a collapsing world of Taíno families, already breaking under disease, violence, and forced labor. The crown would later order Spanish women to be shipped across the ocean, but by then the damage had already seeded itself, not in paperwork, but in the genome. Because history may soften the language, but DNA does not. Y chromosome studies show it plainly. Puerto Rican paternal lines are overwhelmingly European. Over 85% trace back to Iberian men. But the maternal lines? They tell another truth. More than 60% of Puerto Rican women carry indigenous mtDNA. Add African lineages to the mix, and European maternal ancestry becomes a faint echo. The pattern is sharp, blunt, unforgiving. European men fathered children with Taíno and African women, sometimes through unions, too often through domination. The documents call them marriages. The blood remembers something else. And so, generation by generation, the map of ancestry tilted. Not evenly, not fairly, because this wasn't just colonization, it was a rewriting of origin stories. What happens when conquest doesn't erase, but rewrites the bloodline? The Taino weren't lost. They were folded into new names, new languages, new skin. And just as those names began to settle, just as the islands absorbed their first wound, another force came. Ashore, not seeking gold, but sent in chains. They didn't choose to come. They were taken, ripped from homes in West Africa, from ports in Senegambia, Guinea, and the Gold Coast, loaded into the belly of ships not meant to return, bound for an island they'd never heard of and a life they could never leave. But their story didn't vanish in chains. It survived, in rhythm, in resistance, and in the genome. Geneticists like Moreno Estrada found something extraordinary. Two distinct waves of African DNA in Puerto Rican bodies. One early, short DNA tracks pointing to coastal West Africa brought during the first brutal decades of colonization, and one later, longer, still-breathing segments from West Central Africa arriving during the sugar-fueled frenzy of the 17th and 18th centuries. The DNA even mirrors the slave trade shipping records. The body remembers what the boat logs recorded. And it wasn't evenly spread. In places like Loíza, on Puerto Rico's eastern edge, the African legacy surges. 31.8% of ancestry, triple the island average. Why there? Because that's where the plantations were. That's where sugar was grown, and people were broken. But culture did what shackles could not. It held. You can hear it in the bomba drums, see it in the hips of dancers, feel it in the names passed down. Rodriguez, Ortiz, Colon, names forced, but now carried with power. Santeria, Yoruba echoes, skin kissed by ancestral sun. The map of the African diaspora lives on every block. Even in bondage, identity found a way to survive. But there's a silence in this story. A disappearance no record explains. Because when scientists studied the sex-linked DNA, something was missing. The African maternal line is strong, but the African Y chromosome, the paternal thread, almost vanished. What happened to the men? Where did their blood go? Because not all ancestries are shared equally, and not all genders survive genetically. They searched for him, the indigenous father, the warrior, the fisherman, the man who once taught his children to walk barefoot on sacred land. But in the DNA, he's gone. Not faded, gone. In study after study, including Villar's, the Y chromosome tells a brutal truth. There is no surviving native male lineage in Puerto Rico. Zero. Not one Y-linked marker remains to carry the name of a Taíno man. But the women, they stayed. More than 60% of Puerto Rican maternal DNA traces back to indigenous women, another 27% from African women. European maternal lines, just 11%. This isn't random. It's not evolution. It's a record of power, carved into flesh. European men arrived in overwhelming numbers, took indigenous and African women, sometimes through marriage, too often through force. The result wasn't just cultural mixing, it was gendered erasure. The genome became a battlefield. One side conquered, the other bore the children. History calls it colonization. DNA calls it something more intimate and more devastating. There's a symmetry to it now, a chilling precision. On one side, Y chromosomes, overwhelmingly European. On the other, mtDNA, deeply indigenous and African. A map of survival, yes, but also of loss. Entire male lineages wiped from existence. Entire generations of fathers whose names were never passed down, whose stories stopped with silence. But even in that silence, life continued. Through the daughters, the mothers, the grandmothers who kept memory alive in cooking fires, in lullabies, in stories never written down. Can a people live on if their sons are gone, but their daughters endure? Somehow, yes. And inside those daughters, generation after generation, something began to shift. Something science never expected. Because beyond memory, beyond survival, something new began to evolve. The body remembers. Even when the mind forgets, even when history hides the truth, the genome holds on. And sometimes, it adapts. When European ships brought more than conquest, when they brought disease, starvation, forced labor, the pressure wasn't just cultural. It was biological. Smallpox, typhus, measles, new bacteria, new viruses, new punishments that the indigenous and African immune systems had never seen. For many, it was too much. But in the survivors, something began to change. Scientists today have found markers in Puerto Rican DNA that tell a haunting story. Specific genes, those linked to immunity, inflammation, metabolism, began to shift. They bear the signs of rapid evolution. Not over thousands of years, but in the space of centuries. The genome didn't just endure conquest, it responded to it. Genes that once had no advantage suddenly became crucial. Others, once neutral, were selected for, fiercely. Bodies learned to hold calories longer, fight harder, burn slower. Because survival now depended on adaptation, or extinction, this wasn't healing, this was war. And the battlefield wasn't land, it was blood. Every surviving generation carried forward the scars of what their ancestors had endured, not in memory, but in bone, in the invisible wiring of their biology. You can't see these mutations, you can't touch them. But they're there. Your body doesn't just remember your past, it fights to carry it. And as the genome rebuilt itself under pressure, something else began to take shape. A mutation not of immunity, but of identity. Because somewhere in that mosaic of survival, a new dialect emerged. Not in language, but in lineage. Not in accent, but in ancestry. And it carried an unmistakable voice. The voice of Europe, but not from Europe. Something Iberian, but changed. Born not in Spain, but in the Caribbean. When most Puerto Ricans say, "I have Spanish blood," they imagine olive-skinned men from Andalusia, castles, conquistadors, a straight line from Madrid to the Caribbean. But the genome tells a different story. When scientists mapped Puerto Rican DNA alongside global populations, something unexpected appeared. A signature, clearly European, but off. It didn't match modern Spaniards, not quite. It was close, but shifted, tilted by time, by heat, by history. This wasn't the DNA of contemporary Europe. It was the echo of a founder population, a genetic imprint left by the small group of Spanish men who arrived during colonization. Isolated, outnumbered, intermarrying, mutating. Over generations, their genes didn't stay European. They became something else. A Latino-European cluster, found only in the Caribbean, shaped not in Seville, but in San Juan. This is what geneticists call drift, when a small group breaks off from a larger population and changes over time, not through intention, but through isolation. And the result? A new version of Europe, born in the New World. So when Puerto Ricans claim Spanish ancestry, they're not wrong. But they're not telling the whole truth, either. They don't carry the same DNA as the people walking the streets of Barcelona today. They carry the fingerprints of colonizers who stayed, who mixed, who planted their legacy into a gene pool they couldn't control. That's not just a heritage, it's a fossil. frozen in the genome, but pulsing beneath every cell. What if the Europe inside you was born in the Americas? But even that isn't the end of the story. Because genes don't just record who, they record when. And the timing of these mixtures, European, African, Indigenous, holds the final key to understanding how Puerto Rico was truly formed. Because none of this happened all at once. It happened in waves. And the genome remembers every single one. Your DNA doesn't just say where you come from, it says when. Like rings inside a tree, the genome keeps count. Not in words, but in length. The longer the DNA tract, the more recent the ancestor. The shorter it gets, the deeper. Into the past it reaches. And when scientists looked closely at Puerto Rican genomes, they didn't just see mixture, they saw timelines. The Taino-European admixture, it began nearly 500 years ago, right after Columbus stepped ashore, right when indigenous communities were collapsing under plague, swords, and crosses. The DNA of survival was already mixing. Then, 7 to 5 generations ago, roughly 1700 to 1800 AD, another spike. A wave of African ancestry surged into the genome. Not gradually, violently. These were the sugar years, the plantation years, when ships came heavy with human cargo and fields ran hot with labor that history barely names. And there it is, marked in genetic tracts. Every generation, every rupture, every forced crossing, etched into the code like a countdown. This isn't poetic, it's literal. Your body carries timestamps. Your blood holds a calendar. So when you look in the mirror, when you celebrate your birthday, you're also wearing the dates of survival, the anniversaries of pain and persistence. If your blood carries dates, whose story is your birthday telling? The warriors, the captives, the child born from a silence no record ever wrote? But even with this genetic clarity, even with dates carved into our cells, history still refused to see us. Because what couldn't be erased from the body was erased on paper, legally, systematically, by design. And that is where the next betrayal begins. Extinction doesn't always happen in battle. Sometimes it happens in ink. They call it paper genocide, a quiet erasure done not with weapons, but with categories. When colonizers couldn't wipe out the Taíno with disease, when forced labor and starvation failed to finish the job, they reached for something more permanent. The census. Taíno were marked black or white, anything but themselves. Indigenous identity was written out of law, out of birth certificates, out of land. Rights, out of existence. And for generations, that trick worked. By the year 2000, only 0.4% of Puerto Ricans identified as native, not because they weren't there, but because the system told them they weren't allowed to be. Even families who knew, whose elders spoke of Taíno grandmothers, of sacred herbs, of spirits in rivers, learned to stay silent. It wasn't safe to remember. But DNA didn't forget. When the genome was finally read, when mitochondrial studies were published, it turned out over 60% of Puerto Rican maternal lines were indigenous. Not legend, not nostalgia, proof. You can erase a name from a form, but not from a chromosome. And suddenly, a quiet revolution began. People who had been told for centuries they were extinct started reclaiming the name Taíno, not as a costume, but as inheritance. Language was revived, ceremonies returned. Ancestry was no longer a question of permission. It was a declaration. Not all embraced it. Some still resist, afraid of what this truth means for everything they were taught. But as the genome speaks louder and as the records crumble, something older rises from the silence. And as the dust clears, a deeper question emerges. Because if the Taíno were never truly gone, if they are still here, in voice, in skin, in cell, then what? Else have we misunderstood? Puerto Rico was never a melting pot. It didn't blur its past, it layered it. This island holds not one story, but 3 voices singing at once. Taíno, African, Spanish, not blended, stacked, surviving side by side, in blood, in custom, in contradiction. Walk through any barrio and you'll see it. The Taíno still speak, in the names of storms, in the words barbacoa, hamaca, huracan, carved into the language like fossils beneath the street. The African legacy pulses in rhythm, in the drums of bomba, in the sway of hips that never forgot the continent they were torn from. It dances through Loíza in every footstep that pounds against forgetting. And the Spanish, its voice is loudest in the churches, in the surnames, in the bones of the law that still governs. But under it all, the body knows the truth. Puerto Rico is an archive. Every person, a library. Every family line, a manuscript of survival. And for centuries, those pages were ignored, dismissed, burned. But now, science holds the key, not to rewrite the story, but to finally read it. Geneticists are now turning their eyes to other islands. And what they're finding? The pattern repeats. So-called extinct peoples showing up in saliva, in bone, in places once thought emptied by conquest. It turns out extinction was just a pause in recognition. What if your ancestors never left you, just waited to be proven real? Because this is only one island, and the Caribbean holds many, each with its own silence, each with its own truth. Waiting. In the next chapter, we explore another Caribbean island, where history lied again,